Okay, so this is Carol Ann Duffy's Mrs. Midas analysis by David Freed and Anjan. So first, we'll start off with some background on the original Midas story. So Midas was a rich king with a love for his family. He saved a drunk named Silenus and took him in. Silenus was the mentor to the Greek god of wine and pleasure, Dionysus. Dionysus was grateful for what Midas did and granted him a wish. Midas wished for everything he touched to turn into gold. At first, he was elated that everything he touched turned into gold like he wished. But as he as the day went on, he tried to eat and was able to, and was unable to because all his food turned to gold. He gave his beloved daughter a hug, and she turned to a statue. And then he realized that his wish was in many ways a curse. Midas prayed to have the wish removed, and it was. He removed it by washing his hands in a river, and then he began to share his wealth with the rest of his kingdom. So here are some differences between what we'll see in the poem and the original story. So Duffy's story is set in the modern era because you can tell us by the references to automobiles, telephones, and also historical events that would not have happened. Um, Duffy's story is more of an examination of a concept than a fully fledged myth. Has a little emphasis on how Midas got his wish. And Duffy's story, there's a permanence to Midas's touch, and it'll never be lifted. In order to portray the early destruction of a couple that is still his potential in life, Midas and his wife in Mrs. Midas are young with no children and should have had a prosperous life ahead of them. So here are some allusions. So fondant d'atome, it's just a type of pear. I was kind of confused, so I researched that. The field of the cloth of gold that also comes up, and it's kind of used as a simile or a metaphor. And it was a historical event. It was a show of wealth between the kings of France and England, kind of in the 1500s to show which country was richer. The tomb of Tutankhamun, also known as King Tut, is a was an ancient Egyptian king buried in a golden sarcophagus in a room filled with gold. Another simile, and then the music of Pan is used towards the end of the poem. Pan was a Greek god of the wild shepherds and flocks. He's famous for his rustic music. In the traditional story of Midas, Midas became a devout follower of Pan after he re regained after he got rid of his curse. Um, Duffy's poem Mrs. Midas is a commentary on how selfish greed and ambition for capital upsets the balance of harmony of life and prevents us from fulfilling our more basic needs and desires and stifles our humanity. So it's basically a criticism on greed and how it can destroy people's lives. So here we go. Greed. Duffy is criticizing the quest for money. She uses a man in the poem to represent that people only care about money and do not realize how destructive this focus can be, just as showing how the quest for money can harm a family and relationships by upsetting the balance of desires in man. And then lifelessness in Miss Midas. Gold serves to anti-personify the object of life or just remove life from them. Everything that turns to gold loses its lifelike qualities. The perfection of gold upsets the delicate balance of life because life has good things and bad things, but if everything is gold, then it kind of messes with that. The tomb of King Tut is filled with gold, so it's also a tomb. So like you kind of juxtapose there. The baby of the Midas family has a latch for a tongue or limbs. So I mean, it's gold, but it's also like a weird like creature. And then lips turn to a work of art. So normally like lips are people's way of talking and expressing love, but they're turned to a work of
All right, so now that we've explored some of the background and context of Duffy's Mrs. Midas, as well as the differences between Duffy's Mrs. Midas and the original myth of Midas in context, we can now get into the actual poem itself. The annotations. It's really a beautiful poem, very well written, lots of figurative language, literary devices that we can analyze. So let's get into it right now. We start with wine and unwind, and that just shows the relaxed mood of the poem in the first stanza. That it's just a very lively place, this kitchen with its steamy breath, so that's being personified. And that kitchen being personified really shows that food and the kitchen itself are bringing life into the Midas household. Excuse me, I have a cold, so that might be why my voice is a little nasal. But, anyways, and we see that Mrs. Midas is wiping the glass of the kitchen like a bro. So that is or brow. So that is the personification of the kitchen. And then we look at this pear tree. That just indicates that we're in a temperate climate here. Now we talk about a garden. The garden was long, the visibility poor. So the garden indicates it represents life. We're talking about growing food. And this is a really interesting line, a lot to unpack here. The way the dark of the ground seems to drink the light of the sky. So that symbolism, light represents life, and this is actually foreshadowing later on that the darkness, the Midas touch, is going to drink the life out of its surroundings. Um, Fondant d'automne is a breed of pear. We go over that in the illusion slide. And now we get into more symbolism about light, light representing life. So the pear sits in his palm like a light bulb. And here we even have some magical realism. He's putting fairy lights in the tree. Now, we have more magical realism with a lot of metaphors and similes that represent how mundane objects in the poem are becoming fantastical, lavish, ridiculously expensive things within the Midas household. So we're talking about doorknobs gleaming, field of the cloth and gold. That's field of the cloth of gold. That's a referring to a monarchical competition to display lavishness, burnished thrones, so that a chair that Midas sat in became gold. And now we get into these three words. This combination is very interesting. Strange, wild, vain. That kind of shows that Midas himself is chaotically enthused by this new power, just that combination of three words. Now we look at Mrs. Midas serving up the meal. That's the product of the lively kitchen. In the first few stanzas, first two stanzas. But now is where the tone shifts from lively to lifeless, because within seconds, Midas was spitting out the teeth of the rich. So all of a sudden, that corn that he was eating is no longer alive, and now we can see Mrs. Midas is scared. She poured with a shaking hand the wine, and okay, here we just have another uh, metaphor, golden chalice. So we're talking about a golden cup that just glorifies, makes the cup, the mundane object, kind of magically golden. All right, now we really get into lifelessness and fear. So Mrs. Midas started to scream. He collapsed, and now we get into seeing how the Midas touch is sucking the life out of its surroundings. So that's why Mrs. Midas had to lock the cat in the cellar. And now this stanza is really interesting. This is this the sixth stanza over here. Look, we all have wishes granted, but who has wishes granted? So that's that parallel structure. So using the same words, we just have to infer the meaning. So the first wishes that are granted, they're talking more about things that we're working for ourselves. But the second wishes granted, we're talking about real wishes, real divine wishes that we don't have to work for at all. They're just somehow appearing. So that's magical realism. That doesn't really even happen. Um, Now we get into the value of gold itself, because as we see, it feeds no one, slakes no thirst, and slaking no thirst is interesting because it does slake a thirst. It slakes a thirst for greed. But is greed and ambition, is that really a physical, more baser thirst? Is that something that we really need as much? Maybe not. I think that's what the poem is trying to indicate here with Duffy. And this is, again, magical realism, comparing a cigarette that Midas touches to a lute, a beautiful musical instrument. And giving up smoking for good is interesting because now it paints smoking almost as a very human activity. Now we get into more lifelessness. So separate beds indicates that their lively physical relationship is coming to an end, and near petrified just shows that Mrs. Midas is extremely scared of Midas because of the Midas touch. Now, this specific illusion, there's really a lot to unpack here. The tomb of Tutankhamun, Tutankhamun, of course, being an Egyptian king who was buried with a lot of golden objects, surrounded by a lot of golden objects. Now, it's interesting because we're comparing Midas to someone who is surrounded by all this lavish gold, but also have to remember that the tomb of Tutankhamun means that Tutankhamun is dead, so it indicates that Midas is dying, or that he is lifeless. Um, and then we're just talking about that physical relationship coming to an end, passionate then, fast food, almost a physical state of consumption, hunger between the Midas couple that is now coming to an end because of the Midas touch. This stands over here. I believe this stands at 8. Really interesting because it adds a lot of nuance here as to the moral issues, the moral statements that Duffy is making, and who, when it comes to the crunch, can live with a heart of gold. Now, a heart of gold is obviously someone who's selfless, but saying that who, when it comes to the crunch, who, when hard times come, can really be selfless, it almost indicates Duffy is almost advocating for selfishness, or at least acting within self interest. So, this poem is a commentary on the lifelessness that greed brings, that uh, one track minded ambition brings. But at the same time, Duffy is still saying that we can be self interested. Now, here, in that second half of the stanza, we call this anti-personification. We we basically made that term up, but what it really means is that we're taking a lifelike object, the baby in this case of Midas and Mrs. Midas, and we are taking out the lifelike qualities of it. We're objectifying it so that that baby has perfect or limbs, and the tongue is like a precious latch. So the Midas touch is really taking the life out of even that which is supremely living, like a human baby. And at the end here, she is waking to the streaming sun. That's just a temporal thing, indicates that this dream must have kept her asleep for a very long time, and then by the time she woke up, the sun was already high in the sky. Now, we're getting into another shift here in the storyline. So Midas is moving out, and he has to move out under cover dark because that's the only thing that can hide his true powers, which are dangerous and scary. Um, uh, Mrs. Midas describes herself as the woman who married the fool, who wished for gold, and that calls to question: is it really foolish to have this kind of single-minded ambition or greed? Now we have a little foreshadowing here at first. So at first she visited. That indicates that later on she's going to stop visiting, and we're going to see that in the last stanza anyway. And then finally we have just the lifelessness. Um, a hair hung from a large, so that's a dead hair. A beautiful lemon mistake. A golden trout on the grass, so those are dead animals. He was thin, delirious, so he's barely alive. And the music of Pan, that's an allusion to Pan, the god of wooded glens, who has the hindquarters and head of a goat and the torso of a man. Um, and so that's basically means that Midas is being attracted to these wooded glens. He's lost touch with human civilization, and that was the last straw, just an idiom to show that Midas at this point is losing her husband. Now, this last stanza, we can infer that Midas is dead because Mrs. Midas says, "What gets me now?" So that now really indicates that we're reflecting on a time when Mr. Midas was still alive, which we can infer is no longer the case. And this is a reflective stanza. We can see that the lines are getting longer towards the end, and that structurally emphasizes that we're getting more and more reflective here, more and more general, more and more emotional and feelings. We're talking more about feelings rather than specific, bullet pointed, almost listed events. And so we also talk about lights here. Um, and lights again, those are just um, symbols for life, but those have only become memories at this point because Mr. Midas is no longer alive, and therefore Mrs. Midas can only think of him in certain lights, think of him when he was alive, um, rather than really be able to see him. And that last line is really very reflective and sad. I miss most even now his hands, his warm hands on my skin, his touch. And so I just connected this to a quote from Nassim Nicholas Taleb, a philosopher that I read. And the quote is: "Man can only ever desire status, knowledge, or love at one time, rarely ever two, never all three." So the connection here is that Midas clearly desired gold, he desired status, he desired money and wealth, and because of that desire that he had, he was not able to focus on the love of his life and that relationship. Now, we're just going to go into some analysis slides, but we've covered most of this in the annotations, just some more consolidated information here. So we have four different tone shifts. So four different tones. That's how the poem is structured. So first Midas is at home, then Midas leaves the house. Within that we have lively. So the first two stanzas very lively. After that it becomes lifeless, as we learned that the Midas touch is really more of a curse. I'm sorry for the voice crack. And then after Midas leaves the house, he is alone. So the theme is that they're alone. And then How are you feeling? And then finally, we're talking about Midas dying, and that's just more the reflection part of the poem. And just uh, just breaking that down a little more, in the first two stanzas, we're looking at wholesome themes of light, of life, of food. Then it becomes lifeless. We're seeing that Midas is no longer able to satisfy his base hunger, his thirst, his desires. Mrs. Midas is no longer able to satisfy her desire for him. And then alone, we see a real permanence. And this is where Duffy's poem splits from the myth of Midas, where um, where it becomes almost an irreversible curse. And that's really to show the permanence of decisions that Duffy is trying to illustrate with his poem, or trying to make clear with his poem. And then finally, Midas dies. We just get into that reflection stage. Their themes of death here are explored through the dead animals and plants that or foods that Midas has created in his in before he died, and it's clear here that the Midas touch caused their entire lives to unravel. So that's just really tragic. Literary devices here. We've been through all of these. We got personification, anti-personification, which is that literary device that we invented for the sake of this poem. Allusions, which we have a slide on. Metaphors and similes, foreshadowing and symbolism. So let's go through all of those. Just to rehash that. Personification, that's in the first two stanzas. We're looking at lifelike kitchens and such, really looking at the wholesome context from which this poem is set. Anti-personification, that's more to illustrate the lifelessness that the Midas touch brings, especially with the baby that has become dead and has become a perfect or limbs and having a tongue like a precious latch. Illusions are a lot of it is related to magical realism, where we're taking mundane objects within the Midas household and turning them into these glorified, lavish objects that we only really read about in books or movies, things like that. Metaphors and similes, same thing. We're talking about representing the everyday objects in Midas's house as these lavish things that we all know of. Foreshadowing, that's most specifically referring to that one time in stanza 9 where Mrs. Midas says, "At first I visited." That's just to show that Mrs. Midas is going to end up stop visiting, so that's just a structural thing. And then symbolism, that mostly refers to the symbolism of light throughout the poem, where light is being used as a proxy for life, and we can just see how the light gets drained from the poem. All right, the speaker subject relationship. So the speaker is Mrs. Midas. So that would be the wife of Midas himself. Her point of view is that of a loving and young wife in a middle class modern family. We can infer that's a middle class modern family just from some of the context clues, some of the objects in their daily life. She lives in a temperate climate, and we know that from the pear tree. The subject is Mr. Midas and the Midas marriage. So there are two subjects, obviously. One is Midas himself, the other is the relationship between Mrs. Midas and Midas. And it's important to identify the subject because we can really see the entire poem itself is the devolution and death, and eventual death of Mr. Midas. And That's why we can call this poem a tragedy, because it takes a happy situation and it just takes it to its logical extreme, complete devolvement and death of the Midas family because of the Midas touch. And so these are just some of our works cited, and now we will get into the counter poem that we wrote, Mr. Midas. Thank you.
Okay, so for our wow factor, we decided to write a poem from the perspective of Mr. Midas. And so here it is. It was late September. Dusk was setting in, and she was inside making dinner, a glass of wine in her hand. I was out in my garden under the pear tree. I picked up a twig that had fallen to the ground. It was a baton. Had it worked? I reached for the pear, and it was Edison himself. I thought of her, how happy she would be for me, for us. We could finally escape the rat race. I came into the house, or was it a palace? After all, my doorknob was made of gold. She did not understand, but I explained my wish to her. She told me it was but a curse. I laughed, but was confused. The product of her powerful kitchen had arrived. Eat your corn, she proclaimed, with pleasure. But I could feel pleasure no more. I took a hard bite. Frick! I cried out, though through three broken teeth and a mouthful of metal. From my hunger for gold, I would never satisfy my hunger for food. The wine. I held for the merest possibility that the wine would go down just fine. She screamed, I fell, and I quickly realized that life was no longer mine. I was back to my couch in the basement, like many times before, but this time was different. She locked the door to our room, and I could not touch her. From my hung- from my hunger from gold, I would never again satisfy my hunger for her. It was a sleepless night. That I was sleeping on a solid slab of metal did not strengthen my slumber. It's time, Kig Tunt, she yelled. That was my new nickname. It took weeks of planning, but I was being shipped off to my uncle's cabin in the deepest woods. Bang! She let the box with the hazmat suit tumble down the stairs to me. It was a great effort not to turn it into gold. My skin covered from head to toe. My clothes weighed the world on my body. I eventually succeeded in getting to the van without rendering it priceless. It was 4 hours in silence till we made it to the cabin. She bid me from farewell from too far away. That was it. No kiss, no hug, no embrace like it used to be. That was how the love of my life left me. She said she would visit, but I did not believe her. After the van drifted away, I took off the suit, and as the day went on, everything turned to gold. It was just me and my thoughts. She would visit now and then, but it would never be like what we had. I was just trying to provide a better life for my family, and I ended up destroying the relationship with the only person that I had ever loved. All because I wanted money. I was left to myself. I began to hear her and see her. I was able to get close, but when I went to touch her, she would disappear. I would do anything to be able to feel her touch again, but I know it will never happen. This is it. I go dark.